Hey, welcome to Biblios, the space where we think about biblical thinking. Today we'll be asking the question, does the Bible discriminate against people with disabilities?
With us we have Pastor Patrick Johnson, who's currently finishing his doctorate, and he's looking at disability, so he's a perfect guest to discuss this with.
Thinking of a controversial passage found in Leviticus. Maybe some of you watching have tried to get through Leviticus. It's quite a heavy-going book. Yes. But no, there are some interesting things in there. And in Leviticus 21, it is speaking particularly about the rules for those who were the priests. This is what it says. It says, "No man who has any defect may come near. No man who is blind, lame, disfigured, deformed. No man with a crippled foot or a hand, or who is hunchbacked or dwarfed, or who has any eye defect, or who has festering or running sores." And the King James Version says, we're describing those who ought to be qualified to be that of a priest. You can't have a flat nose. And, compared to some, my nose may be considered to be flat, so I may be disqualified according to Leviticus. And so that's why we're asking the question, does the Bible discriminate against people with disabilities?
That's a very tough text to be looking at. It's interesting because when you look at it, it seems to be talking about obvious physical disabilities. It doesn't say anything about the deaf. Hidden disabilities, doesn't say anything about those. It's obvious ones. So maybe there's a clue in that there somewhere. It also says that they're not allowed to offer in the holy place, one of the places where these kind of offerings were done. But they could still be in the priesthood. They could still eat the holy meals that only priests could eat, etc. So it's not like they would be cast out of the priesthood if they had some kind of disability. There's this specific thing about offering certain sacrifices in the holy place. Does that help? Well, it's a good question. When you look at it, first of all, you think, well, that's quite ableist, actually, talking about disabilities in that way. If you were to take that text in isolation, you could walk away and say the Bible is just against people with disabilities. This one here is within a part of the Bible that's to do with holiness, describing God and His holiness, etc. When you look at some of the other parts of the Bible, it brings some interesting stories in about disability. For example, if you look in the historical part with the patriarchs, the founding fathers of Israel, God's people, there's one of them named Jacob. He has this encounter with a holy being, which many people say that could have been Jesus, and he ends up disabled afterwards. So he has a problem with his hip. And what's interesting is the person who writes it says, and because of this, the Israelites no longer eat the muscle that goes across that joint.
Of humans or
of the animals. Of the animals. As a reminder that actually disability is part of your identity. They would keep reminding themselves, this is part of who you are. That's not the only one. So you've got other examples. David, who's a king, so this is in the kingly part of what's going on in the history of Israel. He takes over from another family where the ruling person was named Saul, and Saul had a son who had a disability. Dropped when he was a baby, lame, etc.
Was it Mephibosheth?
That's right. David brings him into the royal court. Again, this reminder that disability is actually part of your identity as a people. Job is another example of it, and he describes himself as hideous. And in God's response, God talks about some of the hideous animals and says, I'm the one that's created these, and look how majestic they are. Again, to bring in that, okay, it's not just black and white, that disability is far away from God. Actually, He's bringing it in. So you've almost got to kind of take it within a larger context.
Even in taking it within a larger context, why would it be there in the first place? Because I guess everything you talked about has been about how people relate to each other or how they respect those who are disabled. It's just a bit awkward that you've got this text here in Leviticus which basically says, if you have these disabilities, you are not allowed to serve God in this way. And I guess on top of that, I guess the people believe God had made them. And so isn't He responsible for that in the first place anyway?
Yes, indeed. And I think the fact that they are still, they're not excluded from priesthood, gives us a clue. Why would it be there in the first place? Maybe we've got to think about, okay, who is God speaking to? What do they understand? And He uses the animal that was to be sacrificed, had to be without any kind of blemish or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
The person offering it had to be the same. Now, these were supposed to symbolize Jesus who was to come,
Mm-hmm.
and what he was like. Yet what's really interesting is that what we believe as Christians, that the premier thing that Jesus brought, salvation as we call it,
Mm-hmm.
happened by him being broken and disabled, etc. So it's almost like God does this incredible reversal of the whole thing, and he has to almost teach slaves, which is what he's doing here.
Mm-hmm.
Don't bring the worst of what you've got, bring the best, because I deserve the best. And I think that's part of it. I'm not saying it's the final answer, but it's almost like, don't bring your worst animals, bring the best, because I'm going to bring my best. And this is what it would be like in the minds of, well, people that would think, well, these are the ultimate, perfect beings, and this is how it should be.
So it's more of a symbol than saying God values disabled people less.
Yeah, I think so. And there are so many stories in the Bible of where God speaks about him being the God of the downtrodden, the less fortunate, if you want to use that term,
Mm-hmm.
etc. He's always that kind of a God for those people.
Mm-hmm.
It was to underline for people who had been in slavery for 400 years, I'm giving my best, you bring your best as well, and these two have to meet together. And yes, it was, again, part of the thing is that you've got why is it physical disability and not the hidden disabilities? It's because that's what they were
It's
seeing.
a visual. It's tests like these where people can see a massive contrast between like the Old Testament and the New Testament. So for example, in the New Testament, you find Jesus spending a lot of his time with people who aren't abled, and on that basis making them abled. But like it's almost here that God's trying to avoid those people kind of thing. Why do you think the dichotomy?
As I say, I think he's saying something specific to a group of freed slaves, making a certain point to them here.
So it's context. Yeah.
Indeed. Some of those stories I've already mentioned to you, especially David's one where he looks after Mephibosheth. It's no wonder God says, now there's a man after my heart. I think he's saying David shows what my mentality is like. He honored Mephibosheth by bringing him to his table. And you will see many of the other texts that are used in the prophets a little bit later in the Old Testament where God is trying to give messages to Israel, etc. It's as if God judges them by how they treat the lowliest among them. And that's how he seems to see, to measure success.
Yeah.
How did you treat the poor, the widows, the orphans, etc., etc.? So if you take it in that context, I think the Old Testament is just as good as the New.
Mm-hmm.
How about today? How do we relate to disability today? Because I recognise what you're saying in that this was a particular context, a particular time.
Well, let me jump in there, Julian, as well, because I think there's a text which kind of goes along really well with what you're trying to say in terms of how we relate. In the New Testament, Paul, who's written a lot of the letters and things within the New Testament, he's talking about this
Most
time.
of them.
Well, yeah. Where he's talking about this time where he really felt bad about some kind of condition he had. And it got to the point where he was begging God to take it away from him. And I just want to read you from 2 Corinthians. I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. So in terms of what Julian was saying, when it came to the question of what about today, is what we get in 2 Corinthians more of what we're looking at today, or is it more of Leviticus? Which context?
Yeah, I think we are definitely leaning more towards what the New Testament, what you just read. But still, in a sense, we've got a long way to go in the church. For part of my research, I interviewed church members with obvious physical disabilities, just to hear their experience in church. And it's quite a mixed bag. There are some very sad stories of what's happening with our people in our churches just because they have a disability. So, Jesus has given us the ideal, if you like. Paul says, okay, I will boast in my weakness because God's strength can be shown through me. But all too often, our members with some kind of disability aren't given the opportunity to even serve. And that's quite sad. We're not even including them because we're thinking of them as a burden, as we have to do things for them rather than them being resources. So we, within the church, need to think about why are our attitudes the way they are. That's part of the reason why I wanted to do this dissertation, because we really do need to change our attitudes towards this.
I think that's a really important point that you're making. I have a sister who is disabled, and I recognise that sometimes people do look at people with disabilities as perhaps as though maybe they ought to take a back seat, when in reality, they have a lot to offer us. And recognize we are making that distinction between the Old and the New Testament. If even some of the patriarchs, had disabilities, and we constantly see that emphasis on the need to take care of people who we might consider to be less fortunate than those who are more able, then I think it's important that we do carry those principles through to today. And so I'm wondering, what can we do?
Yes.
What advice?
I think we've got to
today?
start at a place where we are all equals. Because part of the problem today is that we think of the abled and the disabled on two different levels, rather than thinking we're all equal. That's one of the things actual Paul talks about, that we are all part of the body. We've got different functions. And he even says the weaker members are treated with even special respect. So we've got to think everybody is on equal footing and everybody has something to contribute to the body of Christ. And if we start there, then there won't be this kind of dichotomy between the abled and the disabled, but that we're all following Christ in some way.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick. You just, raised some thoughts from my head which I really hadn't considered, and ways in which we as a people can relate better to those who are disabled. And I think it's really something that we could explore for so much longer. So you've got to come back and we can talk about it some more.
Thank you for watching. Let us know what you think about the Bible and disabilities by leaving us a comment below. Check out last week's episode by clicking here, and we'll see you next time.